and share content, screen to and share. Okay. Okay, so today should be super simple. We're just going to go through some foundations, some basics of motor learning. Okay, so what's motor learning? So what we're talking about here is the acquisition and or modification, so some kind of change in a skilled action. So we're also going to be using the term recovery of function. You see that you see this in the textbook. This is the specific variant of motor learning that is particularly relevant to you. And so we've got an entire so one of your assigned lectures is going to be on this topic. So you should. So I'm guessing you'll find that lecture pretty interesting. But as I said before, it's not really part of the foundations that we need to make sure that we've laid down. Okay, so what's recovery of function? We're talking about the reacquisition of movement skills lost through injury, or the reality of most rehabilitation, the progress towards towards reacquisition. Okay, so here's a really big rule of thumb. We are most likely to perceive and integrate aspects of the environment that are most pertinent. So this, and we can translate this into a principle for practice. So with regard to therapy, patients are most likely to learn tasks in environments that are relevant and meaningful to them. So a core principle that you do actually see supported in large amounts of research is that if you want someone to learn something, thinking about context matters. And this is a principle that we can connect to the systems perspective that we've got in this particular class quite nicely, because you want to be wrapping your head around what is the context of constraints that's going to promote effective learning. Okay, so I just used a technical term, learning. And I want to make sure we're on the same page about what learning actually is. So we've got the term performance. So the term performance refers to the act of executing a specific skill at a specific time in a particular situation. So the wonderful thing about performance, actually, we'll just come down here first, is that performance is directly observable. So you can practice, and from practice you can see an improvement in performance, but the performance gains are not necessarily retained. Now, okay, so that is a key part of the distinction between performance and learning. So learning is going to be a change in the capability of a person to perform a skill. So this needs to be inferred. It's not something that can be directly observed, and we infer it from whether or not we're seeing a relatively permanent improvement in the capacity to perform an action. So in this context, then, we can't say that learning has occurred unless we have some kind of an evaluation that the change that we're seeing is relatively permanent. And the two key types of evaluation that we'll be looking at in this study, and is relevant for you thinking about what it means to interpret changes in patients, is looking at retention and transfer. So retention means that you get a performance improvement that's retained later in time, 20 minutes later, a day later, a week later, a month later, a year later, and you're getting retention in transfer tasks. So we hinted at the significance of context on the previous slide. why do we care about the term transfer? You take someone through a 12-week gait retraining in the clinic. That is, and you get to the point that they have stable and effective gait in the clinic, but then they go home or they go into a context where they like actually live their lives, and those benefits aren't retained. You have no transfer. Learning in any meaningful sense has not really occurred. Okay, so here's two other terms. We've got learning and memory. So learning is the acquisition of knowledge or ability, and memory is the retention and storage of that knowledge or ability. So memory is referring to resources that support the learning to occur. So learning is reflecting the process by which we acquire knowledge, and memory is the product of that process. Like what we're actually being able to see measurably change. Okay, so let's just think about aspects of motor learning. So motor learning is a process of acquiring the capability for skilled action. In general, motor learning is going to result from experience or practice. Motor learning, as we talked about the slide before last, can't be measured directly, but is going to be inferred based upon improvements in behavior. And motor learning is going to produce relatively permanent changes in behavior. I understand to a lot of you, this is all super basic stuff. Just want to make sure we're on the same page. Okay, so let's so we laid some foundations. Let's elaborate on this a little bit. So what kind of a definition of motor learning could we come up with when we're incorporating some of the knowledge from recent theories of motor learning? Motor learning is going to emerge, is going to be the product of the complex interaction of perception, cognition, and action processes. So you can see the connection to the systems modeling. So exact same takeaway that I'm making multiple times. The phenomena that we care about, like the nature of functionality. So I was giving this lesson just now with respect to cognition and perception. Motor learning is not just motor. We'll see some specific examples of this as we go through. And motor learning is going to result in the learning of context-adapted task solutions. So when we're talking about motor control and the ability to perform an action using particular types of perceptual resources, cognitive resources, and motor resources, motor learning is going to be adapted to and is going to draw upon the resources that exist in the particular learning environment. And we're going to see some evidence that suggests how profound particular subtleties of context can be for the nature and the quality of learning that happens. So some examples of this is that in learning a skilled action, especially, what's going to be learned might be a special purpose action solution, a way of organizing the muscles of your body, a particular configuration of synergies that would allow you to solve a particular action task that exists in a particular context. And in the same way, we can think about special purpose perceptual solutions, that you can learn to detect information that's relevant to you solving a particular task in a particular context. And you can understand why this is the case, because in different contexts, the physical support for performing an action in one context and another context might differ. So therefore, when you're learning to organize your synergies to take advantage of the physics that exists, that's relevant in that situation, that it can differ across those situations, and therefore you can learn different things. And the same thing with the perceptual solutions. If you train someone in a particular environment, the like simplest example in a well illuminated environment, and then you're asking it to transfer that to a poorly illuminated environment, the learning is far less likely to transfer, because people will learn a solution that's adapted to the resources that they have available to them. So these are very like broad strokes conclusions, and I'll show you some of the research that leads us to these particular types of conclusions as we go through this part of the class. Okay, here's another general distinction. We've got explicit learning or memory on one side, and implicit learning or memory on the other side. And and parentheses, we've got declarative on one side and non-declarative on another, and explicit and implicit and declarative and non-declarative will get used interchangeably in the literature. But I'll explain the connection between them in a second. Okay, so in explicit learning, what we're seeing is that people are obtaining conscious knowledge of explicit steps in performing an action. In implicit learning, what we're seeing is people retaining a motor skill. They're able to perform that action. So let's take the dumb example of learning to tie your shoelaces. On the one side, we've got learning what to do for performing the particular skill, and on the other side we've got learning how to do the action. So when we look on the what to do side, on the explicit learning side, we've got a knowledge that would be reflected in your ability to know to have memorized the explicit steps that are involved in tying your shoes. So if you were to verbally describe to someone, okay, these are the steps that you would that you would learn, like so start off by creating bunny ears with the laces would be one step. Your ability to ask someone to go, okay, I want you to tell me what those steps are, and for them to have knowledge of those steps, they have explicit knowledge. Now your ability to know those steps and be able to recite those steps, as we'll see when we look at the theories of stages of motor learning, is actually an important type type of knowledge in early stages of motor learning. So so we've got one type of learning and one type of knowledge on the one side. Okay, on the other side, we've got the memory supporting the actual act of tying your shoelaces. So think about this: the way that you tie your shoelaces now, does it even have explicit steps clearly defined within it anymore? What you perform is an action. Do you think about those steps? No, you don't. Well, you might do, but I'm going to assume that you don't. But a lot of the actions that you'll perform without thinking about them. They're going to be implicit. Okay, so here's the declarative versus non-declarative. On the one side, the type of knowledge that that we're talking about, you could actually declare what it is. You could say out loud, you could state what it is. That's where we get the distinction between declarative and non-declarative. But when you have a highly skilled, well-practiced action, such as like how you would tie shoelaces now, that might be completely unconscious and might be a blur of motion, there's your ability to actually like declare what those steps are starts to disappear, because the steps start to blend into each other. Okay, so let's think about the qualities of these two distinctions. On the one side, explicit learning is going to require conscious processes such as awareness, attention, and reflection. And on the other side, as I've been hinting at, is requiring automatic processes. On the one side, with explicit, you can practice this type of learning in ways other than actually doing the task. So we're going to be talking about mental imagery and the role of mental imagery in learning and practice. With declarative learning, you can go along and you can try and mentally rehearse what the steps in tying your shoelaces actually are. Get those steps down pat, and you can actually mentally visualize these effectively. you cannot do this for implicit learning. The practice you need for this type of learning is actually doing the action. Okay, so we got another basic distinction, and we'll see this distinction turn up a few times through this class. So one trend that we see, one rule of thumb, is that in learning to perform a task, you gain explicit knowledge, you have a cognitive understanding about what the task entails, and then through repetition, through practice of the task, you begin to gain implicit, non-declarative knowledge of that task. So this is going to fit quite nicely with Fitt's model of the different stages of learning, where the emphasis at the early stages of learning that we'll be going to be talking about next class is on more cognitive stages, where conscious attention and monitoring is needed. And then later on, the role of cognition is going to be reduced when what you have learnt becomes more automatic. So here, just to flesh out the example that I gave on the previous page, I'll just leave you to look at, is just some explicit declarations of what the steps in tying shoelaces might be. And we've got a child and an adult here, with the child is when you're likely to be experiencing learning to tie your shoelaces, and actually training of learning, having knowledge of there being specific steps can be super useful. Okay, so we've got this notion of implicit learning. Implicit learning can be divided into a number of subtypes. So we've got non-associative, associative, and procedural implicit learning. And we're gonna so this is a lot of this stuff. I'm sure you've come across this stuff before, maybe even like in intro classes in undergrad, but we're just going to touch upon them briefly just to make sure that we are on the same page. Okay, non-associative forms of learning. So habituation. So with habituation, we're going to see a learned suppression of a response stimulus. So what would be an example of this? So you've got a withdrawal reflex, so a reflex where you will reflexively move part of your body away from something dangerous in the environment. So you feel some temperature on your hand, you reflexively remove it away from the flame. If the literature shows that we can provide training, and you can train out a lot of these reflexes to a large degree. But by virtue of repeated exposures, you habituate the reflex, and therefore make the response less likely to see. A more mundane example: learning to sleep near a busy road. You grow up in the countryside, you move to the city, you're in an apartment that's super noisy. The first few nights that you will have there, you'll have restless nights, because the stimuli that you're experiencing is normally something that you would have learned to have a reaction to, and over time you can learn to counteract that. In the context of rehabilitation, there's habituation exercises in the context of treating dizziness. Okay, so in the context of neural mechanisms, we can think about these simple conceptions of plasticity and habituation. So during learning, we see that the continued presence of a stimulus, so living in that noisy neighborhood, causes structural changes in sensory cells that would lead you to not have the reaction that you would normally have. Okay, so normally in learning theory, you see the habituation and sensitization paired, but here's sensitization. Here we see an increased responsiveness following a threatening or noxious stimuli. So here's the example I alluded to earlier. If you have a frail older adult, an individual who the consequences for them tripping and falling is high, it would be functional for them to be sensitized to have reasonably strong response to a part of the environment that could make them fall over. We can see the parallel here, looking at plasticity again, and here we're seeing the strengthening of responses by virtue of how the nervous system connectivity is organized to potentially injurious or noxious stimuli. Okay, so let's keep going. So we got associative forms of learning. So with associative forms of learning, a person learns to predict particular relationships. So we've got non-associative, we just looked at. Now we're looking at associative. Okay, so we can learn to predict the relationships of one stimulus to another, or relationship of one's behavior to a consequence of that behavior. These two particular types of relationships refer to two different types of learning in the literature: classical conditioning on the one side and operant conditioning on the other. In the case of classical conditioning, this is going to consist of learning to pair two stimuli. So here's what you would probably come across in an undergraduate class. So before learning, we have a conditioned stimuli, like the bell. So thinking of like Pavlov, like dog salivating type experiments. And normally, when you hear a bell, there's no learned response to that bell. Now in the Pavlov learning experiment, you have an unconditioned stimulus. So normally you have a meaningful connection existing between food and an unconditioned response to that, which is salivating. So now you bring the dog in, ring the bell, give the food, ring the bell, give the food, do that multiple times, and after, a new connection is created between the sound of the bell and what now becomes the conditioned response, formerly the unconditioned response, which is going to be salivation. So for those of you who are fans of The Office, I've put a link to a video where Jim classically conditions Dwight to help you remember what classical conditioning is. Okay, so we looked at classical conditioning. Now let's look at operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is considered trial and error learning. And so originally this is from studies where we're looking at rats. You put them in a cage, and in the corner of the cage is a button where if they happen to press that button, a food pellet will fall out. So by trial and error, for walking around the cage, like jumping on things, exploring things, you accidentally press the button and a food pellet arrives. So what you see through this this trial and error learning is that you discover that there's a connection between something that you've done and a meaningful consequence. So what do you end up learning here? You learn to expect to receive something to eat following the performance of a particular action. Okay, so in the context of operant conditioning, there's something called the law of effect. And we're going to focus on this because it's an interesting rule of thumb. Behaviors that are rewarded tend to be repeated. So as rules of thumb for thinking about working with patients. Behaviors that are followed by adversive stimuli are not usually repeated. So there are mechanisms inbuilt into our nervous system that make these rules of thumb pretty good rules of thumb for what it means to understand what it means to learn something. Okay, so behaviors followed by an adversive stimuli are not usually repeated. So you've got an older adult. I think I've mentioned this example before. It's one of my favorites. You're an older adult. You're starting to lose some of your capabilities. You engage in your regular activities. Try to walk down the street. You trip over, and you end up hurting yourself doing something you would normally do. You have engaged in an action, a behavior that you normally participate in, and then an adversive consequence of that, a stimuli of becoming hurt, has been encountered. So what does this older adult learn? they learn that that walking a particular part of the environment, engaging in an everyday activity, is associated with falls. These kinds of connections are quite powerful. And one of the things that you'll encounter with patients is that the ability to get a patient to engage in a particular intervention is in as positive a way as possible is actually going to be negatively impacted by their fear of performing particular actions. So these kinds of connections are going to be tightly connected to the idea that negative outcomes are going to make you fearful of doing particular things. In my own experience, I've worked with patients trying to investigate whether or not a new design of exoskeleton could benefit particular patient groups, and one of the key challenges was actually getting the patient to trust the exoskeleton and to actually be willing to allow the exoskeleton to carry their body weight to a certain extent, and to overcome that fearfulness was actually a challenge. Okay. Another example, verbal praise for a job well good. That wasn't a sentence. Verbal praise for a job well done. So by giving verbal praise, you're training a patient that trying is going to be associated with a positive outcome. So praise at a fundamental level, and we'll talk about this when we're talking about feedback, is potentially a really valuable part of what it means to organize organized training. Okay, so the last one we've got is procedural learning when we're talking about associative forms of learning. So here we're talking about learning tasks that can be performed automatically. So getting to the point where you can repeat a task multiple times and get to the point where you can perform a task without attention or conscious thought. So motor skills are going to develop slowly through repetitions of the act. So let's give you some context for the background to this kind of learning. So a friend of mine studies infant development, and she's collected some wonderful statistics. So motor skill develops through the repetition of an act. So here we have two toddlers similar to my daughter's age, and over many trials, toddlers are going to learn to perform particular actions. So if you take a toddler of the age that we're looking at here, the kind of daily experience that they get is traveling the distance of about 39 football fields a day. So even when toddlers are crawling, even if you actually measure how much experience, how much movement they get, they travel about 39 football fields a day. And when they begin to walk, they're taking about 15 falls an hour on average. So I mention this because it gives you a context for when people are actually living their lives, the rich experience that they're actually getting that can especially if you're encouraging them to shape their experiences, how that experience can actually lead to positive outcomes. And the other thing that people are getting in real world settings is they're getting experience of repeating acts under varied circumstances. In the clinic, the reality is that the experience you're going to get is going to be repeated under similar experiences multiple times, unless you make a conscious effort to make sure that's not the case. And we'll be talking about motivations to do that later. But real world experience is often going to be under varying circumstances. Okay, so here's an example that exists in the developmental literature, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if Sudha doesn't show you some videos of this. This is the mobile paradigm. So this is some research, and I'm not sure if you can see it perfectly, but we've got a little bit of string tied to the right toe, the right great toe of this infant. And you can see the bottom of some soft cubes in the air. So the way this experiment works is that when the string is pulled upon, it will jiggle the mobile. So we're going to be looking at infants here, and we're going to be looking at infants who really don't do that much. They don't engage in that many actions, but even like even like 2 to 6 months old infants, this research shows that like interesting connections can be drawn, and can be drawn quite quickly. Okay, so you tie a bit of string to their toe, they end up randomly moving one of their legs. When they move the leg with the string attached to it, the mobile moves. What do they end up learning in this experiment is that when they move that foot, something fun happens. There's a positive consequence. There's an interesting outcome to acting in that particular way. Okay, I've got the question written on the screen here. What type of learning is this? So in terms of the types of learning we've been through, what type of learning is this? So we haven't got too many options.
Would it be operant?
Very nice. Yep, it's so this is an example of operant conditioning. So when you're learning these different terms, I'm wanting you to get these terms because they will allow you to identify different styles, different techniques that you would be using for particular learning to occur. Okay, thanks, Oscar. Okay, so that is all we're going to cover when it comes to the basics of learning. Okay, so we have got a so because I've reorganized the class, I have got a we're going to have a bit more time to work with, which potentially means that we'll have time for a review session now. But I would like you to make a choice now. Would you like to continue going through more material now, and therefore increase the chances that we'll have time for a review session later on that might benefit your ability to succeed in exam 1, or would you prefer to satiate your desire to have an earlier day on Friday and head out earlier? So by show of hands, who would like to just try and make some more progress with the material now? Okay, I think I am seeing a slight majority. So okay, so let's move on to the next lecture. Okay. Okay, give me 1 second to set it up. Okay, so next topic is going to be trying to try and get our head wrapped around the concept of there being stages of motor learning. So this is about we're going to look at three different theories, and I'd like you to try and get away from the idea that there's such a thing as the right theory. So the practicality of this is that in the case of motor learning, but in a lot of what we know based upon the scientific knowledge. There is no one theory that nicely explains and wraps up the phenomena. And the reality is that different theories, their role is really about giving you different types of valuable intuitions about the nature of the phenomena that you're interested in. So I'm going to take you through three theories. It's not that you can, like, once that we're going through them in order, and the earlier ones are the ones that we've since shown are stupid, which, I mean, I'm sure you've encountered this in some of the classes. The reality here is that each of these theories gives us slightly distinct ways of conceptualizing what it means for someone to learn something, and has a emphasis that gives us some intuitions about the particular things that matter for someone progressing through those stages. So, okay, so with that said, let's start with the first theory. So the first one is the Fitz-Posner three-stage model of motor learning. So we're going to have three stages of learning. We've got a cognitive stage, an associative stage, and an autonomous stage. And what I want you to do when you go working through this material, and what's hinted at in the study guide, is I want you to, like, wrap your head around what's going on in each of these stages, and what's going to matter in those different stages. Because when you have those intuitions about what matters in those different stages, you can be thinking about how to vary the specifics of the intervention that you're engaged in to adapt to what might be needed to facilitate improved learning as you move through those stages. And to further contextualize this, so we're going to be going through the theories today to build your intuitions, and then then when we're going through principles, when we're looking at the research in the principles, we'll actually see that research that connects with and supports the intuitions that we've got here. Okay, so stage one, the cognitive stage. Here, the learner attempts to understand the nature of the task. So think about the shoelace example. With the declarative knowledge, you're understanding the nature of the task, that you have to form the bunny ears, you have to grab the shoelaces in a particular way. So the learner is attempting to understand the nature of the task and is going to use information from a variety of sources. So different sources that they might use might be observation, so like watching someone else tie their shoelaces or demonstrate the different stages of tying shoelaces. It might be verbal feedback. I put from a PT because that's obviously is relevant, and from the sensory feedback that's generated from actually trying it out. So paying attention to you try to do something, what it actually looks like is going to be valuable for you understanding the nature of the task, and especially when you think about connecting this to something like mental practice, practicing something, visualizing a step, and then that's going to facilitate you being able to mentally practice it. Okay, so what's a key characteristic of this? Each of these efforts require a high degree of cognitive activity, like most specifically attention. Now, in this model, what we're seeing here, what's going to happen during this particular stage of motor learning is going to be a trial and error process. You're going to be trying out multiple different ways of doing these things, performing the action. Okay, what does this mean? This means that if someone is in this stage of motor learning, one of the signs that they're in this stage of motor learning is going to be the fact that you're going to see numerous big errors as they're trying different strategies to do the task. So in this cognitive stage, you're going to have like a broad conception of what it is that you want to do. And you're going to try some strategies for trying to achieve that, and your attempts at doing this when you actually try to put it into actual physical practice, your conception in some cases is going to play out really well, and in other times it's going to suck. And depending upon where you are on that continuum, you're going to get smaller errors or bigger errors. So what does this mean? This means that as you're trying out these like different gross types of strategies, you're going to see large improvements at certain times when you've uncovered an effective strategy.
Dr. Harrison, in
Yes.
that model, does proprioception fall under the sensory feedback?
So any type of perceptual information could can fall under this.
Okay, it's just confusing, I think, because we generally have we considered proprioceptive as cognitive?
So sorry, say that again, Bonner.
It's just confusing because I never associated like proprioceptive sensory as something that's cognitive.
So, but here we're not. So, what we're talking about here is not your ability to use your senses in an integrated action. We're talking about your ability to perceive to cognitively attend to like what your body feels like or what position it's in using your senses in order to build up a mental conception of what's actually going on in the action. So your ability to perceive like what sort of position your body is in via proprioception is going to be part of the sensory feedback that would go into your cognitive conception of what you're doing. Now that's quite different from the role of proprioception in the context of when we're in the autonomous stage or even the associative stage for building up connections between proprioceptive information and the control of the action.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've moved from the cognitive stage to the associative stage. So in the associative stage, the learner is going to begin to understand how the various components of the skill are interrelated. So when I described the difference between the novice shoelace tire and the expert, I talked about the expert having like a blur of motion. In the blur of motion, you don't the distinction between the different parts starts to fade away. It starts to become one fluid motion. Here we're beginning that process where we begin to understand how the different declarative stages that we had of okay, I need to do this, 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 and this, how they begin to interrelate. And in this stage, you begin to detect errors in performance, and you begin to provide to develop appropriate solutions to that. So here we're talking. So something like proprioception, like Borna was talking about. In this particular stage, you begin to learn like when an action doesn't feel right, and begin to associate when the unfolding of an action not feeling right should lead to you to modify that action in a particular way, to come up with particular solutions to those particular types of errors. So an individual in the associative stage can modify and adapt the movement patterns as the situation demands. So in the cognitive stage, the kind of knowledge you have is at its most context independent. And here, when you're actually starting to learn how, when you're putting this action into practice, how the action plays out and how it begins to go wrong. What you're going to learn how to modify and adapt the actions to the different types of situations that you're performing the action in, and how the movement is going to unfold differently based upon that change in situation. Okay, so the process of refining the particular pattern. So cognitive stage, come up with a gross pattern. the associative stage, we start refining that pattern. So in terms of the characteristics of what we might see, we would expect to see fewer errors as because the best general solution has been converged upon, and what we're going to be doing is just taking that good solution, or that ballpark good enough solution, and we're going to be refining it. So what does this mean? This means that over time, the improvements we're going to see are going to occur more slowly. We're no longer going to see those big leaps, or we're less likely to see those big leaps. Okay, so let's contextualize this. Here we've got a tennis player performing a forehand return. This player is able to direct her forehand stroke to different areas of the court if she's in the associative stage, because she understands in this stage how to contextualize it to the situation. She understands how to orient her body and the position of her feet prior to contacting the ball, in order to accommodate the change in situation of the ball coming from a particular direction, and in order to accommodate her intention to get the ball to go to a different part of the court when she hits it back. Okay, so let's look at a like vague rehab example. So here we have the idea where a patient entering this stage of relearning during rehabilitation is going to be capable of detecting errors and solving problems independent of the therapist. So in the cognitive stage, the function of the therapist is going to be much more explicit. Being able to provide clear instructions in the cognitive stage is going to be super important. As you move further and further through the skill learning process, the role played by the rehab professional is going to want to change based upon what we understand from the stages of motor learning. Okay, so the implication at this stage, the use of facilitation techniques, or verbal descriptions, or manual guidance may be counterproductive. So when we're talking about manual guidance is a technique that's going to be useful for revealing to a patient a gross pattern of motion. Converging upon a gross pattern of motion is going to be something that's going to want to be discovered, or is thought to be discovered, at the cognitive stage. Once you're past understanding that pattern, manually guiding the patient through that pattern is not going to be useful from a motor learning perspective. It might be useful from a physical support standpoint, in terms of actually physically getting them into the ballpark of being able to perform the motion, but from a motor learning standpoint, not so much. Okay, then we reach the autonomous stage. Okay, I was just checking the time. Okay, during this stage, the movement patterns become automatic, is that word we were using earlier. When they become automatic, attention can be directed to other aspects of performance. In the autonomous stage, your use of cognitive resources is going to be significantly reduced. So this connects quite nicely to what we were learning about in the last part of our postural control lecture. So what does this mean? This means that the learner is able to perform the necessary set of movements consistently and in a variety of different movement situations. The other thing that's going to be going on here is that because it's become automatic, and that you don't have to direct your attention to performing the specifics of the action, you can use your attention in new and more functional ways. So you can begin to direct your attention towards the subtleties of the situation that would lead you to adapt the action. So it's a whole new level of functionality. So an interesting aspect here is that the cognitive aspects of performance are no longer accessible to the learner. The learner has largely given over control of movement of the movement to subsystems at lower levels in the central nervous system. So let's connect this back to back to posture. What think about the Huxhold experiment, where when you're directing your attention towards an automatic action, that your ability to perform that action was diminished. This theory speaks nicely to why we have that prediction. Okay, so when your movement is automatic, or when the patient's movement is automatic, what do we expect? We expect fewer errors as the best solution has been chosen, and that in the associative stages, particular strategies for creating corrections and adaptations to offset errors have actually been generated. What we're going to see during this stage is we're seeing subtle changes necessary to improve performance. Are going to be mastered. So so your ability to tune into those subtle things that could interfere with the effectiveness of your behavior, you're going to improve your ability. You're going to refine your ability to tune into that. Okay, so let's look at some like simple examples again. A player like a football player we're talking about here, sorry, soccer player entering the stage is going to be able to learn to adapt to the movement of the other players on the field. So why is this part of the autonomous stage? So in the autonomous stage, you are able to perform things like making defending movements or dribbling the ball in a way where you don't have to think about the specifics of doing this. When you don't have to cognitively focus on the specifics, this allows you to direct your attention to what the defender is doing, or what the attacker is doing as it's coming towards you. You're able to attend to other subtle aspects, more complex aspects, and you're able to use this to allow you to plan strategies for your future movements. So we've mastered a subcomponent of the skill, and then when you've reached the autonomous stage for that sub skill, then it opens the door to you being able to more effectively engage in learning the more complex forms of that activity. Okay, so here's a clinical implication. So distractions. So the example we've got here is ongoing conversations should be possible when a patient is performing a well-practiced task. So the ability for a patient where you're doing balance retraining, when their balance retraining has got to the stage that it's automatic and they're not having to devote cognitive resources to engaging in those balance training skills, their ability to perform a secondary task like you having a chat with them, they're going to be in this autonomous stage when you can distract them and you're not seeing a big impact on the particular skill you're trying to train them. So in this stage, the introduction of multiple tasks should be possible. Okay, so let's look at some general limitations of this particular way of conceptualizing learning. So from the perspective of this theory, it remains difficult to know exactly when a learner is entering each of these stages. I gave you the ballparks, but there's no real clear-cut measures in the literature to say, okay, this is when they're in this stage of learning, therefore you should do this. So that we don't have clear-cut rules. Okay, so we've been through one theory of the progression of learning, of the different stages of learning, and there's some interesting and highly pertinent concepts that fall out of it, and these concepts fall out of the question of what should a learner focus their attention upon in learning. So you have someone in the clinic and you want them to learn a skill as part of their intervention. what instructions should you give them in order to maximize the outcomes of what you're training. Okay, so we're going to look at the example from the basic science literature, where we've got the idea of one type of instruction that you could give someone is an instruction that has an internal focus. So in the context of performing a golf swing here, an instruction with an internal focus would be something like focus on the form of the golf swing, or focus on on what the posture of your leg is at a particular moment in the golf swing, or focus on the amount of force that you're hitting the ball with. So this is asking you to focus on how the action is unfolding, and is going to lead you to attend to the action as it's unfolding. So to have an internal focus on how the action is unfolding. Okay, the general rule of thumb that we get from this is that novices who are just learning the skill are going to become better at performing the skill if you give them an instruction with this type of focus. An expert, if you give the exact same instruction to, is going to show a performance decrement. So you can map this quite nicely onto the Fitz and Posner 3 stages. This is the reason why we're talking about this after the Fitz and Posner three stages of learning, and it fits really nicely with the postural control results of Huxhold. Okay, now the second type of instruction that you could give is to give an instruction with an external focus. So I just want you to focus on hitting the ball closer to the intended target, or I want you to focus on hitting the ball further. Don't okay one golf swing. Okay, you can see where it went. Okay, now I want you to hit the ball further. So it's getting you to focus on the outcome of the action and not to focus on exactly what you're doing so as to create the action. That's why it's an external focus. In this particular, with this particular type of instruction, if you give this particular type of instruction to a novice, someone that's like putting a golf club in their hand, it's the first few hours that they've done it, or the first day that they've done it, you're going to see significant performance decrements. If you give this instruction to an expert, you will see them perform expert. There will be no decrements, and if you give the right instruction, you'll actually see improvements. You'll see steady improvements in performance.
So, question about that. On the last slide, would an expert be someone in stage 3, whereas a novice would be stage 1? Or
yes. So that's the. I mean, that's why the. Well, so so an expert is someone who you would be more likely to define as being in either stages 2 or 3, and a novice so you would most expect to see this effect with novices if they are in the cognitive stage.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's the a second part to the, what we're learning here on the same topic. So here we're going to be thinking about a particular particular way of changing the focus of attention by virtue of manipulating whether or not we've got a single versus dual task. So this is the results that explicitly connect with the Huxhold study. So here we have an expert soccer player. Actually, I don't know if any of you know, but I am a soccer fan. So for the reward of me liking whoever comes up with this more, who knows who this soccer player is? No. Okay. Well, in which case I don't like any of you more.
Yes, Dale.
Oh, well, nice. Who gave the answer? I couldn't see who was speaking. Who is it?
Sorry, it was Borna.
Borna, hi Borna, you are my new friend. Okay, so that is Gareth Bale, who who on and off who has played for my favorite club, which is Tottenham Hotspur. Okay, anyway, so here we have my definition of an expert soccer player. In some research by Belock in 2002, there was they studied soccer players and and how looking at single versus dual tasking during practice could have benefits or detriments for their training. So if you take an expert soccer player, this research shows that they are better with their when dribbling with their dominant foot. So soccer players, like same as handedness, will have a particular side that they will control the ball on to a much greater degree. When you give them the task of controlling the ball, like let's say primarily with their right foot, and you ask them to dribble the ball down the pitch, if you ask them to do this task while also doing a simple dual task, their skillfulness in performing this will be improved. If you ask them to do the exact same thing but with their non-dominant foot, and you give them the instruction to focus on the skill of dribbling, you will see benefits. You will see benefits in that particular case. So when you have the more expert version of the task, you see adding a simple secondary task improves performance. When you have a less expert side, like actually allowing them to focus on the skill, was shown to have a benefit. Okay, so then let's look at the novice players, and we've got the result that we would expect. If you give them a dual task, it's likely to have performance detriments, but when they're first starting out. So if you ask them to focus on the skill that they're doing, you're going to see the performance improvements. So here we can see that the intervention that we've got here of modifying training by like whether or not we would give them an extra simple task to do is going to have benefits depending upon the task and the individual that you're getting to do that task. Okay, so we're just about to start going through the second the second theory. I think that would be a good place to pick up next class, so we can so you can hear all of that at the same time. Okay, so before we break, any does anybody have any questions? Okay, so so I held office hours this past week. I didn't have anybody turn up for the office hours. Did anybody try to come to office hours and wasn't able to come to office hours for some technical reason? Okay, good. So by show of hands, is there anybody that even though there's no commitment to doing so, think that having office hour that they might want to come to office hours? Okay, so it's got a couple of, okay, so I will be so no pressure to come, but I will be in my Husky CT room for office hours. Same time next week. Okay, in which case, have a enjoyable midweek, and I will see you on Friday.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr.
Thanks, Dr. Harrison.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.